This project that I'm working on comes out of the trouble we're in the world. And I think it really requires a lot of courage, endurance, creativity, collectivity, collaboration. As Akoga always says, I guess all the C words, right? Creativity, collectivity, collaboration, really to fight against the forces of fragmentation that we're facing. And we're in a time, as we all know, that really requires kind of new vocabularies without abandoning the old vocabularies, new and old plush political concepts that unlearn and remake the world anew. I feel like the attention that we must give is around a kind of non-reductive complexity, but also clarity. And that's something in the kind of seas of opacities, that we also, in the positive sense as well as negative sense, we also, I really think, need to strive for clarity, given that we're also living in what Naomi Klein has recently called a distorted mirror world, with the rise of the political right. So I've really come to believe that thinkers are also makers. We can argue about that, but I really feel like that's true. We're really working on the project of crafting language into concepts, or what Mary Louise Pratt has called concept work. And that concept work occurs within a history of ideas that gives our concepts relevance. Amitav Ghosh, the wonderful writer, was here 3 weeks ago, and I feel that Amitav contributed enormously to this project in 2017 when he coined the term the Great Derangement, naming the lack of awareness of the magnitude of the current global climate crisis. So we're living in that wake 7 years later in 2024, and we can see that it's not only been a great societal derangement, a great delusion, but it now looks more than ever like a great unraveling. What we're witnessing is a kind of vertiginous, authoritarian, and at the razor's edge of a liberal democracy, or the collapse of a liberal democracy. It's a time, as you know, when a billionaire class continues to ascribe to the ideology of winner take all, deep and acute dislocations, accumulation, mass enforced and fabricated migrations, the idea of sacrifice and extractive zones across the planet, not just in one place, but many places, the multinational corporate thirst for the last non-renewable resources, intensification of borders, urban and rural gentrification. And since I wrote The Extractive Zone, my book, I wrote about kind of medium and smaller scales or big projects of terraformation, but they're now at the level of a mega terraformation, mega extractivism, devastating outcomes, the collapse of public housing system, the collapse of institutions, the collapse of currents, oceanic currents. In this collapse of everything, right, and the threat of extinction, I guess what I'm interested in is there any kind of political concept within the colonial Anthropocene that can save us? And the answer probably is no, right? And if you came today for an answer, I'm sorry to say I'm not going to give that to you. It's 9 a.m, middle of the semester, and no concept can actually do that kind of heavy lifting. So I'm going to take that burden off for a minute. But I really think that for me, it's overwhelming, and the kind of state of overwhelm. I've really been in that moment of the state of overwhelm, not just because of the emails, right? It's just a kind of tidal wave that our world is in crisis. So in that moment, I think about escape and the possibility of an opening by going to the sea. And that's where I kind of begin this talk today. There's a path that's 5 minutes from my house in East Greenwich where I walk, I think, I try to imagine with and beyond the tide, with and beyond the privatized beach that's there, within the historic of colonial transits, but also to take a moment of breath, like Alexis Pauline Gumbs reminds us to do, and to take in the ions and in this embodied feminist decolonial praxis in order to clear my mind. Then I remember, right? And I return to the history of ideas, to not just live in the head. The ocean and the Oceanic, as Rebecca Schneider in this room knows, has been a constant source of political and conceptual creativity. I'd say that especially this is true in Caribbean philosophy. And so I want to think with and from that Black diasporic space of memory between the Caribbean and the Atlantic, and that in the early 1990s, Edward Glissant famously stated, quote, "Imagine, if you will, a chain of islands in a varying sea that separates the islands as it links them. Then picture this chain as the first of many. You might like to reflect exactly what you have just called to mind. Was it the archipelagos of the Caribbean, or was it the globe that we inhabit?" End quote. So Glissant's archipelagic poetics describe not only these islands to reimagine land, not just in relation to the sea, but also the liquidity of the continents, the liquid continents. Glissant engaged an expansive view of how the sea not only shapes the interconnected island systems and the cultural forms of the Caribbean, but our own planetary condition and the modes of interlinked relations between humans and the non-human and more than human others. For Glissant, it's this archipelagic thought that has a material basis that literally maps the geophysical disappearances in a climate change world, of course, with the island being at the center of that landmass disappearance. It also attends to the monoculture of continental thinking. So how to decenter continental thinking that has erased the rich multiplicity that emerges out of the archipelago. So to really take Glissant and expand this oceanic thinking, I've been working with the term Tide-lectics, a term that comes from the work of Barbadian poet and historian Kamau Braithwaite, or Bathawaichi. I've heard it pronounced many ways, Braithwaite, who crystallized what he called our, quote, terrestrial obsession for fixity, assuredness, and appropriation, end quote. As Braithwaite discusses, quote, "We must work instead to raise the fluctuating rhythmic sounds of the waves of the sea and the curling ripples as they wash onto the shores," end quote. Some of us in this room have been studying and thinking together about the work that elemental thinking and elemental political concepts can do in a project called the Elemental Media Lab out of MCM. I think of Braithwaite as an elemental thinker, if something is possible, like an elemental thinker. As he says, quote, "If dialectics is a way that Western philosophy has assumed people's lives should be, then Tide-lectics move us into deeper layers of meaning, involving a range of different readings and interpretations, for water itself is a transitory element," end quote. I find that this movement then to Tide-lectics offers a kind of social poesis that's provocative and is not only a metaphor for the dynamics of thinking itself and the mind as potentially an oceanscape as well, thinking as a processual oceanscape, but also moves us toward a kind of non-extractive practice of collaboration in the ebb and the flow of the tide. What I find more difficult to account for, I have to be honest, in Tide-lectics and within the kind of oeuvre of this work is a kind of erotics of territory and sea, a way to not only rewrite the Western history, but also the masculinized history of ideas that I've been describing, how not to reinscribe the paternalistic logics of the extractive gaze. So even a term like Tide-lectics can be lodged within a heteropatriarchal imaginary. In my forthcoming work on Sea Edges, I really try to describe and think through Tide-lectics, how it can account for processual, dynamic, and an expansive quality of the erosion of power. I think that's part of what Braithwaite's up to through a poetics of erosion and eroding and decomposition. But it's also left me wanting, I have to be honest, in relation to what I term the gender and sex elemental readings of land and sea. So in that gap, then, I want to turn to Black feminist Caribbean thought and complicate even further and suggest the work of someone like Stacey Ann Chin, whose poetry collection Crossfire, A Litany for Survival, really describes, and there's been a lot of litanies lately. It feels like we need litanies as a genre right now in some ways. So A Litany for Survival describes the coming century not only as sea level devastation, but also as a kind of rising tide of Black, female, and queer leveling against centuries of colonial genocide and patriarchy. This coming tide, a tide that comes through lived experiences and passes and stays with that. It comes through embodiment as an archive to suggest and counter-narrate these painful colonial histories of land and sea, but that continue to be reenacted under present racialized power structures. But I'd suggest it also offers a kind of opening. And this work that I'm doing is really compendiant to a book I wrote called Beyond the Pink Tide, Art and Political Undercurrents. You can see the language that I'm using there about how it really kind of takes all of us to address, and the us we can, think about, the us and the we always want to kind of condition, but the kind of anti-gender, anti-indigenous, anti-black backlash that we're facing. And how it requires a kind of accelerated, in the face of acceleration, and also an accelerated coordination of allies and queers and trans scholars, thinkers, activists, artists, makers, gig economy workers, all of us, in the way that I think Veronica Gago points to in the Feminist Strike book, all of us to address the magnitude of this current political, social, economic, global crisis. So whether we describe, and I think it's limited in some ways to describe it as climate change, or we consider it as the afterlives of the colonial Anthropocene, we also have to think about ruination that has taken place in the wake of racial and extractive capitalism. As I said, that razor edge, the call for political concepts also refers to that razor edge. And in that moment, it's really difficult sometimes to think about collaborative potential or making the world otherwise. So that's what I'm interested in. And in that project, I want to move us off the land. But I want to be very careful and thoughtful about what it means to move off the land. At the 2019 Venice Biennial, the Anglo-US queer performer and artist Jonas proposes exactly this, that we move off the land, away from solid territory to instead orient towards the Oceanic. Through montage, poetry, narrative, performance, oral history, drawings, video footage, and installation based upon maritime spaces, Jonas's work communicates the delicate ecologies of the ocean, its biodiversity, the beautiful presence of oceanic aquatic life, and the complicated imprint of the human's engagement with it. Jonas's body of work not only footnotes the conditions of the liquid planet and its dire kind of urgency, but also the precarity of those who depend on the sea for their livelihood. So I would call this kind of project and body of work of moving off the land a kind of feminist, poetic, and critically mournful engagement that leaves room for potentiality of marine life on the other side of what many have referred to as the sixth extinction, or the anthropogenic, fossil fuel-induced climate emergency. In this longer arc of Jonas's work, we might think about the sea's edge that has always been present there. And I went back and kind of trying to track in the work, where was the sea edge? And the artist has been contending with the blurry lines between human, animal, and geological forms. The exploration began with Beach Peace in 1970. Anyone know this work? Yeah, a groundbreaking performance that took place at Jones Beach in Long Island, New York, home of many unceded tribes. Interestingly, in 2019, that became the first place in New York, Long Island, to test. There was a COVID-19 testing site. So there's kind of this deeper palimpsestic way you can read what's happened at Jonas Beach. In some ways, Beach Peace performed, albeit in a positive sense, the breakdown in the ecology between the human and the other human that lies at the core of the pandemic. At the time, this piece was based on what Jonas called, quote, the idea of how our perception of image and movement is altered by distance, end quote. In interviews at the time, Jonas described how beach peace was also a way to work outdoors, a way to get away from the white boxes or the indoor space of the gallery. As she put it, quote, "The outdoors was an unexplored territory for performance," end quote. During the Giuliani, I'm trying to forget. How do you say that? Giuliani era. Thank you. My God, that's like gap there. And ungentrified New York of the 60s and 1970s, creating performances along the industrial shorelines of New York City did not require permits as it does now. And it allowed for a really range of experimental kind of compositions, including the work of Gordon Mata Clark, who, was really looking for greater artistic freedom. I also want to mention that in that Lenape territory of Dutch coloniality, what was left unremarked in this work was the documentation of the resurgence of indigenous movements that were taking place at the time, like the American Indian movement, AIM. So the work really tries to incorporate paintings and images and slides, especially from Rachel Carson's Ocean trilogy. It's incorporative, it's not critical in any way. And it also plays with surfaces in really interesting ways, the kind of experimentations of thinking about a place called Ocean Space, which is in Venice, and like working with this kind of layered footage, montage, the sea, the performer's body, the dog, the performer's, Joan Jonas's dog as well, Black children, all kinds of layered compositions that are part of the work. When this work was actually exhibited, shortly after, the space actually flooded. And it flooded with the rising tide of more than 6 feet, just right during the exhibit. This work has been commissioned by the group TBA 21 that some of you might know about. And this is work I think we might think about collaborating with at Brown, because it's about an interdisciplinary group of artists, scientists, organizers, and scholars that are interested in intergenerational dialogue and a kind of anti-racist pedagogy about the ocean, and really thinking in this mediatic form about the liquid surround. Moving Off the Land pays specific attention to aquatic life off the Jamaican coast, the current predicament of global industrial overfishing there, the plasticized ocean, the drama of marine non-human life that is displayed within aquariums across the world. So those aquariums are then brought into the exhibit space, but also to kind of bring into relief the proximity of the human and other animal species, the kind of slim genetic boundaries that separate the human from the non-human animal world. The slim boundary is one way that I've been thinking about sea edges, or the sliver edge space of possibility that defines a kind of liquid origin and a return to deep sensitivity in relationship with the ocean at this critical cross currents. While in residency at the Alligator Head Foundation in Portland, Jamaica, Jonas produced a series of recordings that had included interviews with marine biologist David Grober, who's well known for documenting hundreds of unknown fluorescent fish species, and also for developing the squishy robot fingers, or an ultra gentle robot. Not sure if that's, if that can happen, but it's supposed to be an ultra gentle robot, that tools that kind of are engaged with a touch and sensorium, forms of deep sea cataloging and discovery. So one highlight for me of Jonas's exhibition is what I'm thinking about as the environmental or the eco-testimonial, these stories of calamity that are often narrated by direct survivors of the slow and fast diminishment produced by the colonial Anthropocene. A story in the exhibition is told by an unnamed and unmarked, which I find a little, troubling, older Black Jamaican fisherman who describes the kind of depletion to the surrounding ocean and the close observations and tracking of the change to tides of sea life that he witnessed during the course of more than 50 years. This, we might call a kind of longitudinal vernacular knowledge, the way where the fisherman foretells a kind of growing danger of big weather and super hurricanes like Maria in the Caribbean. and really based off living in relationship with the ocean, local fishing practices that have gone extinct, the transformation of fishing itself from an artisanal practice into a commodity boom, and this flattened capitalized view that drains life and cuts our connection to marine life through neoliberal market logics. But it's also the video, a way of working, a way of wonder and awe in the face of survivance, not just in relationship to these fishing practices, but also a kind of climate knowledge that is in indigenous communities and local communities that gets missed out of this kind of bigger meta picture that we're contending with. I'm mesmerized by this work. This work is often just very supple like this. It has political urgency. It has ambitious interdisciplinary scientific and artistic agendas. It intervenes in many ways. And at the same time, it does ask us to move off the land. And so, what is the signification of moving off the land, right? And here I want to bring in other kinds of discussions, this kind of discussion of ancestral homelands for indigenous and African peoples, the question of, rapidly degrading worlds, the imperatives of settler colonialism to violently detach African indigenous peoples from the land in an effort to acquire property in perpetuity. And I love this framing of acquiring property in perpetuity as part of a white settler colonial project. This is Glenn Coulthard's formulation that's also been named by Jody Bird, Aloysia Goldstein, Chandan Reddy, Malamed, and in the kind of discussion of also economies of dispossession, which I find very useful as well. So this kind of idea of moving off the land, the indigenous expropriation, communal sovereignty, but also a kind of subjectification of the systems of transatlantic African enslavement and maritime trade that so many, Cedric Robinson, Orlando Patterson, Idea Hartman, Hortense Spiller, Psychia Jackson, have addressed as a kind of position of accumulation and fungibility and the presumed condition of ontological death for African diasporic peoples. So this as a kind of pause in an environmental history that might erase and do some conceptual and artistic elisions in front of this idea of moving from land to sea. So I understand that, and I want to work with that, and I'm not sure I'm working that out still, so I'll be honest that this is kind of ongoing. I think Tiffany Lethobo King attends to this conceptual difficulty by thinking through Black and Native meanings, and I was just at a conference where Tiffany was there via Zoom and talked about landed solidarities, ongoing projects in relationship to the kind of histories of entanglement of land and sea, but also rewriting and understanding that maybe in this book, Indigenous histories needed to be, that understood as also in contention. Not all Native feminisms, for instance, are saying the same thing. There's a lot of heterogeneity within Indigenous studies that maybe didn't play out in this work, but also saying that this work is a really fecund methodological space, an epistemology, a way to think beyond colonial humanism, a way to think beyond the kind of binarized thinking, and a way to think with water and land, to remember that there is no edge between the histories of Black and Indigenous life. These are co-constitutively produced, and they reside within the sea's memory bank. So to move to closure then and refine and think with Tide-lectics, I really want to think about the next tide and what that may entail. And as I came here, and before buying a house, again, property, acknowledging, I should have probably looked at the rising maps of sea levels for Rhode Island. I will not show you those because they're a different kind of image, but remember that is also with the kind of Narragansett Sea territories that are about kind of reclamation and also the sea reclaiming, and still also working that out. My student and scholar Rebecca Garrison has taught me to think about this kind of climate struggle work through Kanaka Maoli Hawaiian territory, Chamorro Guam, and also Indigenous Vieques, a beautiful project that thinks across 3 island spaces To also think with demilitarization zones of feminist struggles that have always been interested in this rising tide of possibility. We might also think with the late Tongan scholar-poet Epeli Huafa, who in 1993 made a scathing critique of dominant continental paradigms of Pacific islands as small and therefore insignificant places, and instead rewrote a cartographic and epistemological shift born of the sea with indigenous ontologies that recognize the ocean connecting to these islands and the kind of cultural memory as its own source of knowledge and entry points into the climate catastrophe. So just to be clear, I really love Jonas's work, and I'm still thinking with its multidimensional, multimediatic practice, but I also want to address how the Venice Biennale, in its discussion of certain kinds of oceanic art forms, unwittingly participates in a kind of climate justice art and environmental humanities that can whiten, alight, or reproduce the centrality of the global north without disrupting the normativity at the heart of the colonial Anthropocene. So then what to do? How to think against the Western ontology of extractivism, how to make these things visible. So for me, again, it's about thinking with these artistic Creole imaginaries, thinking with rising tides, thinking with the floods that are impending and around us. This is in Rhode Island. Thinking with these kind of multidimensional transversal coalitions and figuring out these other forms of tides, rising tides as political tides of coalition and transversality. And I'll just end by saying also not to forget in those bigger kind of coalitional transversal efforts, how to pay attention to the small, the minute, the provisional, the shifting, and the way the ocean is not only to be sensed, touched with a robot, but also how it senses and touches us. So thank you. I'll end there.